Hey everybody, Doomwake here, and welcome back to another edition of Watching the Meta, the weekly series where we take a look at the Magic the Gathering Online metagame for the three most popular formats. Well, I guess maybe I should say 2.5 popular formats now with the recent announcement of Pioneer. But anyways, we are taking a look at the metagames for Standard, Modern, and Pioneer, and we're going to take a look and see how they're shaping up week to week. First and foremost, before we continue, as always, if you enjoy this type of content, please consider subscribing to the channel. It really does help out that YouTube algorithm. And then also, importantly, leave a comment in the comment section down below. I would love to hear if you guys have any suggestions for improvements on how we can do this moving forward. Are the graphics helpful? Do you guys like how we're showing the entire metagame? And then maybe suggestions for when we look at the spicy decks as well, because that is a pretty big segment of this series. But anyways, we are going to get started with Modern. Last week, we got a little bit of a Boros problem here. 32% Boros, and then the next deck that was even remotely closest to that was Domain, 6%, Ruby Storm, 6%, Teamer, Mono Blue, so on and so forth. Now, I will say, a small caveat, which I did mention in last week's video, if you want to go check that out, link in the description down below. This is only for the top 32 of challenges. So you have to kind of take this information with a grain of salt, right? This is not necessarily, cut and dry. Here is the metagame that you will expect in your local RCQ or whatever local tournament you go to for Modern. But as far as the top 32 of the Magic Online challenges over the weekend, which there was actually, I believe, 7. Let me look at my notes real quick. I want to say there was actually 8 challenges, which is kind of strange. I feel like I haven't seen a weekend where we've had 8 challenges in Modern before, so I don't know if there was an extra one added or something. But Boros Energy still on top, 27.3%, so a little bit of a dip in that. We see a slight increase in Mono Blue Belcher. We went from 5.7 to 10.9%. And another thing that I want to highlight here, Mardu Energy in third place. If you look at last week's data, it was 2.1%. Now it's up to 6.3% and actually did take down a challenge or two, I believe. Let me take a look and give you the numbers here. So these challenges were won by Belcher twice, Grinding Breach twice, and then 4 one-ofs: Teamer Woodlands, Mardu Energy, Boros Energy, and 4-color Omnath. That is what won the 8 challenges that we are looking at data for this weekend. Past that, you see Domain Zoo, which was 6.3% last week, a little bit down to 4.7%. Eldrazi Breach last week, where is it 1.6%, now it's 3.5%, so a slight uptick. Esper Gorios, which, I'm looking on my data sheet. I don't even see it on the data sheet last week. So it went from non-existent to 3.5%, so a little bit of an uptick there. One thing I want to mention on this particular document as well as last week, so you'll see that Dimir Oculus and Dimir Frogtide are 2 separate pieces on the pie graph. The Dimir Frogtide decks are not necessarily not playing Oculus, but the Dimir Frogtide decks have Murktide. The Dimir Oculus decks do not have Murktide. Some of the Frogtide decks have Oculus, some of them don't, but they all have Murktide. The Oculus decks all have Oculus, and none of them have Murktide. That is kind of the differential there, and I do think it is worth mentioning the difference between those two. But in any case, this is what the metagame looks like. It's pretty similar. We're seeing a little bit of a dip in Boros, but most of that is just kind of added to the Mardu Energy, so maybe it's just some Boros players that wanted to cast some Orcish Bowmasters. As far as the interesting decks of the weekend, there are 5 that I wanted to highlight. So the first one is coming in 14th place by Sleeping Snorunt or Sleeping Snorunt. I'm sure there's a reference there, but my brain is a little bit too small to figure that out. This is Teamer Woodlands, or Teamer Glimpse, I think is what I labeled it. This is a deck that Aspiring Spike, I believe, had first started working on, and what it is trying to do, it's trying to achieve Delirium so you can turn on Bloodbraid Marauder, which is a 2-mana 3/1 that cascades. The only hit in your entire deck is Glimpse of Tomorrow. Now, Glimpse can hit some really big stuff. Omniscience to cast stuff for free. You can hit Archon of Cruelty to just get a lot of value that way. And the other cool thing is not only do you have the Bloodbraid Marauder plus Glimpse angle, you can also discard Omniscience to stuff like Seasoned Pyromancer or mill it over with Cash Grabber Rumble, and then utilize Shifting Woodland to become a copy of Omniscience, and then cast your spells for free that way. So really cool deck, utilizing the Delirium mechanic as well as a bunch of stuff to mill and discard, and a bunch of large, expensive threats. Next up we have here, this is sort of in the similar vein, but is not playing the Glimpse stuff. So you'll notice we have a lot of the sort of similar ways to mill over cards. So I guess Rumble, there's no cash grab here, but 4 Malevolent Rumble, and this is in a similar vein trying to put Omniscience in the graveyard and get Delirium for Shifting Woodland. But it's going about that in a slightly different way. So there's no cash grabs, but instead we are utilizing Philology Archaeologist, which I'm sure you've seen before, Oracle of Tragedy, which is a card you probably haven't seen before. It's 2 mana 1/3, enters the battlefield, draw, discard. But these both enable Flare of Denial because they give you blue creatures that are 2 mana that put cards into your graveyard, and they happen to sack the Flare for free. So that's kind of cool, and then Flare's another instant you can put in the graveyard to get some value that way for Delirium. So really cool list by Screenrunner NY, who actually won a challenge with this deck. Pretty impressive. Next up I want to highlight is Selfie Sec, who is a name you may recognize in 26th place here. I think they used to be like a Mardu Pyromancer player, then they were really big on the Mono Black Waste Knot deck, and it looks like they have taken their talents to the Hollow One world. But this is maybe not the Hollow One deck that you're used to. We've seen a little bit of an uptick in the Rakdos Hollow One deck, playing Orcish Bowmasters, Nethergoyf, other black cards. I think maybe had some discard spells as well. But this one is actually Gruul for a couple of reasons. So first of all, Patchwork Beastie, which is a card that I've been playing a lot of in Standard and Pioneer in those Delirium decks, even shown up a little bit in Modern Delirium as well. It's 2 types in the graveyard, which is very, very important. Stuff like Hollow One is 2 types, Fear of Missing Out. You really want a high density of cards that are 2 types because it makes it a lot easier to get the other types for Delirium. Green also gives you Tarmogoyf, which basically you're swapping Nethergoyf for Tarmogoyf. Nethergoyf is probably a better card than Tarmogoyf, but they're close enough. It's totally fine. That's sort of like a 1-for-1 swap. Just kind of a slightly different take on the Hollow One deck. Next up here, JR Citizen in 23rd place. They're after my own heart with this Asmarina Mar de Kaistanakuldakar. Tell me how I did in the comments on that pronunciation, by the way. I'm learning. I'm perfecting my craft. But this is a blue-red. Actually, no, not blue-red. This is Naya? Hold on. This might be mono-red. This might be something similar to what Spike was playing before, but basically Asmo, Channeler, Inti. As your core, you get Ragavan as another cheap 1-mana creature. And yeah, this is a mono-red deck, maybe with some slight splashes in the sideboard for Prismatic Ending, Haywire Might. I'm a huge fan of the Asmo decks. Love Cookbook, love Asmo, Oval Chase Daredevil, all of that synergies. Utilizing Underworld Breach to cast your Galvanic Blast and Lightning Bolts from the graveyard to get, just deal to your opponent those last few points of damage. So really cool list. May have to give this a try myself. And then, last but certainly not least, we got to give a shout out to the one, the only aspiring Spike who top-aided a challenge this past weekend with Jund Delirium. And I wanted to highlight this version. I know we've kind of talked about this a little bit on the channel in the past, and it's very similar to what he had been playing, but he actually, I believe, I had mentioned this in his chat the other day. I tried out his initial version, cutting the Say Its Names for Street Race, and I think he wanted to try that himself. He also made a couple of other changes. He swapped out the Lightning Bolts for a couple of Violent Urges and a couple of Thoughtseizes, and he said he really liked Violent Urge as a way to giving double strike when you're getting a second combat phase with Fear of Missing Out. Pretty unreal. And then when giving double strike when you're giving your creature flying with Detective's Phoenix, also pretty good. So I think this list is pretty clean. If you're interested in the Delirium archetype, you can certainly do worse. And that is our look into Modern. Alrighty, now the format that nobody wants to talk about, Pioneer. So last week we saw a bit of a surge in Is It Phoenix. Last week Is It Phoenix was 12.1. This week it is 13.1. So actually even a little bit higher than last week. But we have a new king on top here, Rakdos Demons, which last week was 5.9%. This week has skyrocketed to 13.8% of the winner's metagame. That's a pretty significant jump, especially overtaking Phoenix as the #1 played deck. Then as far as the mono black deck, you'll notice last week I had it labeled as mono black twin. I would like to announce that moving forward, I have renamed the archetype Mono Black Bloodletter. I still want to make sure that there is a noticeable difference between the versions that have Bloodletter and the versions that don't, because I think they're extremely different decks. But I am removing the twin moniker from the archetype. YouTube commenters, you got me. You win. Just this one time. As far as Rakdos Prowess is concerned, it's roughly the same, 10% versus 11.3. Mardu Greasefang last week, trying to find it here, 6.6, 6.9, relatively the same. Celestia Company, basically the same. So there's not a ton of other shifts, but Rakdos Demons jumping more than 2x its winner's metagame share that it was last week. That's a pretty significant jump. As far as the challenge winners are concerned, there was 5 total challenges. 2 of them were won by Mardu Greasefang, and then 1 Mono Black Bloodletter, 1 Izzet Phoenix, and 1 Celestia Company. So that is a look at the overall metagame, but let's see if we can find some spice in here. So the first one that I have for you is Harry 13 in 17th place. This is Dimir Doomsday Excruciator. So Doomsday Excruciator is a card that costs a whole lot of black mana. It is a 6/6 flyer for 6 mana, and then when it enters, each player exiles all but the bottom 6 cards of their library. Now, the idea here is it's this sort of like a control deck, right? You have a lot of removal with Fatal Push, Heartless Act, Shieldred's Edict, discard with Thoughtseize, Duress, so a ton of ways to interact early. And then eventually you have effectively 4 copies of Doomsday Excruciator because you're playing 2 Council, which can search it, and 2 Excruciator itself. And then 4 Jace the Perfected Mind, which you'll notice the Phyrexian text here. Maybe we can get an English copy up on the screen. But it's a Planeswalker that enters with 5 loyalty, and you can minus X to mill target player 3 times X loyalty. So you can imagine if you Doomsday Excruciator, they have 6 cards in their library. With a Jace in play, you can then -2 the Jace, mill out the rest of their library, pass the turn, and they die to decking. So it's kind of like this blue-black control deck that also has this... Blue-black control deck that has a Splinter Twin-esque finish. You guys have any idea where we may have seen that before in the Pioneer format? No, I got nothing. Anyways, it also has this sort of Archfiend of the Dross plus Unholy Annex angle, which is pretty cool as well. So just like blue-black control with a combo finish, for people who maybe have been playing Pioneer for a while, you may need that itch to scratch. Next up here, top 8, Xenowan. In 8th place here, we have the Simic. I'm calling this Simic Green Shell because I don't know what else to call it. Maybe we can call it Simic Butts because it's all about creatures that have larger toughness than power. I don't know if that's really topical, but anyways. So what we're doing here is we're playing a lot of mana acceleration. So we have Arboreal Grazer, which is put a land from hand into play. Clifftop Lookout, reveal cards until you hit a land, put that land into play. And then there's other mana ramp here. I promise. Spelunking is the other mana ramp here. And then ways to find lands, Spinewoods Armadillo, Outcaster Greenblade searches for a land, puts it into your hand. So you have a bunch of ways to hit your land drops, right? Eventually, what you want to do is you want to get to a place where you have green shell in play. You can also maybe start copying green shells. And the funny thing about copying green shell is they actually trigger off of themselves because they're 4/6s. And then you get to a point where if you also have Spelunking in play in a multiple green shells, you can kind of just chain through a lot of your deck. You pay 1 mana for a Grazer, you hit 2 lands because you have 2 copies of green shells. Maybe those lands are Arid Archways, you can even get more mana from there. All the lands are coming into play untapped because you have Spelunking. Blue Sun's Twilight to steal opponent's creatures, like big things like Shieldred and whatnot. So there is a lot of cool stuff going on here. And top 8, pretty impressive performance here by Xenowan. 21st place here by Kanara 38204. This is an interesting take on the Demons deck. I wanted to showcase this because we've seen a lot of different Demons decks. We've seen Orzhov, Golgari, Rakdos. But the one color that I have not seen people pair with Demons is blue, and this individual has done that with Fairy Mastermind, Flood Pit's Drowner, some counter spells with Phantom Interference, and then most importantly, arguably one of, if not my favorite card in the set, Kaido Bane of Nightmares, which is really cool, especially in combination with Flood Pit's Drowner. You can pick up the Drowner, shock another thing, or stun another thing for a turn. A lot of cool stuff going on here. I may have to give this one a try myself. I failed to mention this, but now we actually have the Pioneer Showcase Challenge. So this was not just 5 regular challenges. This was 4 regular challenges and the Showcase Challenge, which, for those of you who don't know, is a little bit of a higher stakes event. First, the top 8 players of this get invited to the next qualifier, which there's like a ladder system. So basically, it's just like a more prestigious challenge. And this event was won by the Celestia Company player. But I have a couple of decks that I wanted to showcase here. In top 4, 4th place by Mad Max Ernst. This is Zerverlords, something like that. Basically, you may have seen this in Standard, right? Where you have, the idea here is you're playing Zur Eternal Schemer, which is a way to, for 2 mana, you can make an enchantment into a creature that has Death Touch, Lifelink, and Hexproof, and you're pairing that with Overlords, because you can cast these for their discounted cost, and then when Zur animates them as a creature, they get to attack immediately, which is really, really cool. So there's some interesting things you can do there. And then kind of playing this like domain package with, Up the Beanstalk, Leyline Binding, similar to what you've seen in standard domain decks. A couple of Fatal Pushes, and then Flicker of Fate, really cool shout out here, which if you impend an Overlord, you can flicker it, and when it comes back as the creature. So that's kind of cool. This deck looks really sick, and I have tried a little bit of Zur Overlords in Standard. They have to give it a shot in Pioneer. And speaking of standard decks coming into Pioneer, in 14th place in the Showcase Challenge, we have WCL playing Lizards? Flamecash Gecko, Gev Scaled Scorch, Hired Claw, Iridescent Vine Lasher as forms this sort of lizard package. What I really like about this deck is the combination of Kumano Faces Kakazan, Okiba Reckoner Raid alongside Light Up the Stage, where Gev says whenever you play a creature, or whenever you cast a lizard spell, deal 1 damage to your opponent. That turns on Spectacle for Light Up the Stage. But Okiba and Kumano also do that for relatively cheap, and specifically Okiba, you can actually play it on turn 1, and then it'll trigger on turn 2 to make them lose another life, and then that gives you a free way to get Spectacle that turn. Also, a free way to turn on Flamecash Gecko, so you can kind of see some lines with this deck that are pretty explosive. And I didn't really mess with the Lizard package in Pioneer, but the addition of Burning Tree and Bushwhacker do make a lot of sense as well. And that is going to do it for Pioneer. Last but not least, let's take a look and see what Standard looks like. As far as the Standard metagame is concerned, I think this one might have the most radical shifts. So last week, we saw mono white tokens on top at 15.6%. Where is mono white tokens this week? Oh, 4.7. Okay, so a fourth of what it was last week. Now, when it comes to a deck like Gruul Prowess, if you look at last week, 4.7%, 17.2% this week. So, and I don't really know, maybe it's because Standard is a much more evolving metagame where week to week, you're really trying to tackle what did well last week. And it's possible that whatever does well this week, now people will say, okay, we need to find a deck that beats Gruul Prowess. And then that deck will be the most played deck next week. It'll be really interesting to see the shift in dynamics. And I think that's what makes for a very, very good format, and a format that you can keep going back to because it's different every single week. It's never the same deck over and over again. Azorius Oculus, 12.5. Last week was 7.8, so a bit of an increase there. Golgari Midrange, 11.7. Last week was 14.8. Pretty much the same. A slight decrease, but nothing too crazy. Dimir Midrange at 9.4. Last week was 3.9, so pretty big increase there. Jeskai Convoke at 9.4, 6.3 last week. Slight increase. And another deck that I wanted to mention here, the Overlords deck. Here's another one. Last week, it was 0.8% of the metagame. I think it maybe like top-8'd one challenge, and all of a sudden, or I think it might have even top 16 to challenge. And all of a sudden this week, boom, 7%. It was all over the challenges. There was multiple top 8s, a couple of top 16s. So I think what happens is there's a lot of copy paste when it comes to Magic the Gathering Online Standard. Whatever does well in a challenge, people just copy paste that, play it in the next challenge, and you kind of repeat that cycle. So I think there is a good amount of that in the standard MTGO queues. So that could be a part of it as well. But yeah, some interesting shifts in the metagame. Gruul Prowess is definitely one that I have my eye on. If you're playing a standard event within the next week or so, Gruul Prowess is probably the deck to have its target on its back. So, as far as interesting decks, I have 4 for you. Before we go over that, again, there was a standard showcase challenge that was won by Gruul Prowess, and then I could only find data on 3 regular challenges. 2 of them won by Golgari, 1 of them won by Monoblock. And I got 4 deck lists that I want to close out the video with. First one that we want to take a look at is in 15th place by Yoman5. You may have heard that name. Definitely go give Yoman a follow on Twitter. They make some awesome standard content. And this deck list does not disappoint. 4 copies of Cursed Recording, which is a 4-mana artifact. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, put a time counter on it. If there's 7 or more, you remove them and it deals 20 damage to you. So the idea is you get to cast 6 spells with this, but the upside is you can tap it to copy your next instant or sorcery spell. So there's a lot of cool stuff we can copy, mostly Doppelgang, Ill-Timed Explosion, and Make Your Own Luck. Those are the 3 cards that we're kind of going over the top. I mean, you can imagine make your own luck, look at the top 3, plot one of them. When you copy that, you get to cast 2 spells for free next turn. Those could be Overlords, those could be Roxannes, and then if you have multiple Overlords or a Roxanne in play, and then you eventually get to a spot where you're casting Doppelgang, heavens forbid you copy the Doppelgang, they're probably just going to die on the spot. So there's some really cool stuff you can do there. A lot of mana ramp in the form of, like I said, Ancient Cornucopia. There's one Heaped Harvest, and then an interesting card that I haven't really seen before, which is Piggy Bank, which is a 2-mana 3/2. When it dies, you make a treasure. Now, it doesn't look like much, but when combined with something like Torch the Tower as a way to sacrifice it, you can actually just go Torch, sack my Piggy Bank, kill your X3, ramp, and scry. There's a lot of value to be gained from Torch sacrificing Piggy Bank. Next deck I want to take a look at, shout out to last standard format Hoa or Howa. In 25th place, we have Legends. Now, if you're familiar with the Legends deck from the previous format, there was a combo, there was a lot of channel lands like Boseiju, Sokinzan, Takunuma, all this stuff. We don't have any of that here. We're mostly just a value-oriented deck, but we do have a lot of value. Some Marchesa, when you commit crimes, you can draw some cards. Rona is a way to loot. Rona's absurd in this deck, by the way, because you have so many Legends to untap it. Inti to combine with Rona when you're discarding cards, you're triggering Inti, drawing more cards. Rutstein, which discounts all your stuff, but then buys stuff back. And then I guess your end game is probably just something like Aclazotz, Shieldred. You can deal them a lot of damage with Tiny Bones too, because every time you play a Legend, they're losing a life. So some cool stuff there, but to the best of my knowledge, I don't believe there's any infinite combos. But yeah, Relic of Legends, another powerful mana engine that is still in standard. A lot of people forget about Relic. Nyctophobia, big shout out here, playing some Gruul Delirium. Now, this is a little bit different than Delirium decks that I've been playing. I have been focusing a little bit more on the aggressive angle, playing a lot more cheap cards and just a more aggressive curve in general. And Nyctophobia said, you know what? Hold my beer. I'm going to play some 5 and 4 drops. So we have Balustrade Worm and Enduring Courage in the main deck. Courage, I will say, I have been impressed with it in the more aggressive version because giving Fear of Missing Out or Omnivorous Flytrap Haste, pretty absurd. And then Patchwork Beastie, setting up the Delirium stuff. And then we have 4 Cash Grab and 4 Say Its Name. We're playing a Planeswalker in the form of Wrenn and Realmbreaker, and then our enchantment of choice is Hunter's Talent instead of Innkeeper's Talent. I've been kind of messing with both of them. Kind of thinking I'm leaning towards Hunter's Talent as well, so I do like that. And then the Skullspore Nexus, I honestly don't know what this card does, so I'm going to read it very quickly. It's kind of cool. It costs X. If you have a big creature in play, you can cast it for cheap, similar to Great Henge. But yeah, you just want like an extra artifact, so I guess that makes sense. But yeah, this one's kind of cool. It's like a slightly bigger take on it with Balustrade Worm, which you can buy back from the graveyard if you mill it over. So maybe something that is worth trying. And then last but certainly not least, shout out to the one and only CFT Sock 3. I believe they may have done it again. And by done it, I mean broken it. There's been a lot of talk about mono white tokens being one of, if not the best decks in the format, and I love this approach from CFT. What they have created is they have said, okay, we're going to take the best elements of the mono white deck, Beza, Caretaker's Talent, the Sunfalls, and I believe Parting Dust is pretty stock at this point too. So kind of that core, but we're also going to combine it with Collector's Vault and Enigma Jewel, because that engine of being able to just loot every turn and make a treasure for free every single turn if you have Vault plus Jewel just gets you to this obscene amount of mana, especially early on. And then ways to filter out dead cards and control matchups. We're shaved on Carrot Cake a little bit to make room for more Builder's Talents, which I believe is not a card that you see a ton of in the mono white versions. Some Planeswalker here, Jace, Archangel Elspeth, and the Eternal Wanderer. And then blue also gives you some, well, I was going to say, I thought they had negates in their sideboard, but that might have been a different version. Anyways, yeah, you get to play Jace, which is very good in the Domain matchup, which I think is probably one of your weakest matchups from the mono white side of things. So shout out to CFT Sock, just Enigma Jewel. I can't say no to a good Enigma Jewel every now and again. And that is going to do it for today's Watching the Meta. Hope you guys enjoyed this particular look and all the sweet deck lists that we had for you today. Again, as always, please be sure to leave a comment in the comment section down below if you enjoyed the video, if there's anything we can improve on in the future. And until next time, adios.